Hi there, and welcome to Lost in Literature. How do we analyze a short story? If you're a student, your textbooks, especially your literature books, are full of stories. How can you understand it in depth? What I intend to do today is to give you the five things that you've got to look for in a story. And these are the 5 points that you'll be using to analyze a short story. Um, Invariably, what we do is only look at the surface of a story, the storyline, uh, and we have no idea uh, how it works. What we have to do is to look at the story from the inside. And let's try and do that today uh, because that's the fun of it. And that is what goes into the crafting of a story. Um, as an example, I will be taking this particular story called The Elevator by William Sleater. It's a very interesting story. All right, so before we get to it, let's take up the very first element that you have to look at in a story. All right, the first thing that matters to you, that hits you, is the question: where is the story taking place? This calls for the setting. And that's the first thing the writer has to do: give you the setting. All right? Where is all this happening? Where is this uh, event taking place? Because this makes the story very tangible, very real. And that is terribly important because you want to be part of it. You want to, um, you know, um, kind of relate to it. So the writer has the responsibility of drawing you into the situation. And for that, he has to give you a number of details. So let's look at the story, The Elevator by William Sleater. How does it begin? And how does he give you the setting? How does he stroke in these details? Right? And of course, I'll be reading it to you. So here goes. The Elevator by William Sleater. It was an old building with an old elevator, a very small elevator, which could carry only 3 people. Martin, a thin 12-year-old, felt nervous in it from the first day he and his father moved into the apartment. Of course, he was always uncomfortable in elevators, afraid that they would fall, but this one was especially unpleasant. Perhaps this was because of the poor lighting and the dirty walls. Perhaps it was because of the door, which never stayed open long enough and slammed shut with a loud clanging noise. Perhaps it was the way the elevator shuddered each time it left a floor, as if it was exhausted. Maybe it was simply too small. It seemed crowded, even with only 2 people in it. Look at that. Right at the beginning, he has given you the place where the story is set, and that being the elevator. And what kind of elevator it is? An old, um, noisy, unreliable one, probably, um, you know, moving very slowly from floor to floor and kind of getting on your nerves, making you feel phobic. All these things come through. All right? So that's how you work in your setting. An old building, a terrible elevator, and a 12-year-old boy, his father. Now let's see what happens. What is the next element in a story that you have to watch out for? And that is the second point that we should consider is the plot, the structural framework of the story. Excuse me for consulting my notes because I tend to be a little forgetful. But I don't let it impede me really. Okay, so let's look at the plot. Now, the plot is the foundation on which the rest of the story is built up. All right? So basically, it deals with the action in the story. What's happening? What is the situation? What are the circumstantial details? This is what we need to know. Otherwise, a story isn't a story. We want action. So there you are, you know, reading the story, and you could think of it this way, as if the writer is building it block by block on the setting which forms the base. Okay? And it could go in any sequence, the action. Like he could start at the present, shoot back to the past, come back to the present, deal with what's happening, move into the future. It's entirely up to the writer. But many stories are linear and quite comfortable to read. All right? But again, the ones where the structure is more complex, the plot line is more complex, it presents quite a challenge to the reader, and it is technically more sophisticated, and sometimes, or maybe uh, mostly, there is a reason for the writer to shuffle up the happenings so that you get a perceptual sense of how the story emerges, evolves. All right? Now, let's look at the plot structure in the elevator. All right, I'm reading again. One morning, the elevator stopped at the 14th floor, and a fat lady got on. She was wearing an old green coat that ballooned around her. As she waddled into the elevator, Martin was sure he felt it sink under her weight. She was so big that her coat brushed against him, and he had to squeeze himself into a corner. There was no room for anybody else. The door closed quickly behind her, and instead of facing it, she turned round and stared at Martin. He looked at her for a moment. She had large, fleshy cheeks and no chin, just a huge mass of neck. Her blue eyes were tiny, but sharp. They seemed to be boring into Martin's face. Martin looked away, but the woman didn't turn around. She was still looking at him. He glanced at her quickly, then looked away again. She was still watching him. He wanted to close his eyes. He wanted to turn around and stare into the corner. But how could he? The elevator creaked down to 12 and then to 11. The piggy eyes were still looking at him. She had to be crazy. Why else would she stare at him like this? What was she going to do next? She did nothing. She only watched him, breathing loudly until the elevator reached the first floor at last. Martin wanted to run past her to get out, but there was no room. He could only wait as she turned and moved slowly into the lobby. Then he ran. He didn't care what she thought. He ran all the way to school. So there you are. This is how action builds up in a story. All right? And wound up with the action emerges the third point that we'll be considering, and that is the conflict in the story. Always there is some kind of a snarl up in the situation. It could be something external, or it could be something internal, like a trauma or a phobia or something that the protagonist, the main character, has to face. As in the story, The Elevator by William Sleater. Alright, so this conflict is what presents the problem in the story. And it has to be unknotted, resolved. A solution has to be found. But again, it's not mandatory to find a solution. It's up to the storyteller, because sometimes there are no solutions even in real life. So that's how a story works. But a conflict is very important in a story, because that's what the reader is interested in. Once again, let's get back to this story, The Elevator, and take a look at the conflict that builds when day after day Martin runs into this obese woman, strange obese woman, only in the elevator. Have you ever noticed a strange lady in the elevator? He asked his father one evening. Can't say I have, he replied, not looking away from the television. Martin knew he was probably making a mistake, but he had to tell somebody about the woman. She was in the elevator with me twice today. She just kept watching me. She never stopped looking at me for a minute. What are you so worried about now? His father said, turning impatiently away from the television. What am I going to do with you, Martin? Honestly, now you're afraid of some poor old lady. I'm not afraid. You are afraid, said the father. When are you going to grow up and act like a man? Are you going to be timid all your life? Martin didn't want to cry in front of his father, so he waited until he got to his room. His father probably knew he was crying anyway. He slept very little. So there you are. This is how the story moves ahead when Martin tells his father about the problem, and instead of sympathizing with him and assuring him that it's all fine, the father actually confronts the boy. Uh, he is absolutely fed up of his um, thin, um, painfully thin, skinny son who refuses to grow up, be brave, be a man. There is a conflict here between uh, the father's idea of a son and a son's idea of how, you know, he hopes for some kind of um, relief, some kind of consolation, understanding coming from his father, and how it doesn't happen and only increases his anxiety. Now, how is this problem going to be resolved in the story? Because day after day, Martin has to confront this lady, and he lives on the 17th floor. He cannot take the stairs. Why? Because again, the stairs, they are very dark, spooky, shadowed, no windows, dusty, and that is yet another atmosphere that he cannot deal with. So there you are. Martin is in a situation. He has to work it out. The fourth element in a story is characterization. Look at the people in the story. How are they presented to you? Are they contrastive? Um, are they caught in a conflict? What is their nature like? And does the story evolve on account of something, some characteristic, some trait in their nature? For instance, Martin here has this phobia of that fat lady in that cramped up lift. Does the story progress on account of it? How do characters contribute to the story going from point A to B to C to whatever? So the character is important. And when you talk about character, you keep in mind the physical aspect, the description of that person, the nature. What kind of person is that character? What is his reaction to the situation presented in the story? All this contribute to the running of the story. So let's look at the characterization in this particular story. Martin and that fat lady. He thought about her all day. Did she live in the building? He had never seen her before, and the building was not very big. Maybe she was visiting somebody, but 7:30 in the morning was too early for visiting. Martin felt nervous when he got back to the building after school. But why should he be afraid of an old lady? He felt ashamed of himself. He pressed the button and stepped into the elevator, hoping it would not stop. But it stopped on the third floor. Martin watched the door slide open, revealing a green coat, a piggish face, and blue eyes which were already staring at him as if she knew he would be there. It was impossible. It was like a nightmare. But there she was. "Going up?" said Martin. His little voice, just a squeak. She nodded and stepped on. The door slammed. He watched her pudgy hand move towards the buttons. She pressed not 14 but 18, the top floor. The elevator trembled and began to go up. The fat lady watched him and watched him and watched him. How unnerving can it be for a little child? Dreadful. So, that is characterization for you. And it's very vital in a story. You know, from the description of the two people in the elevator, you get this feeling that something is going to happen in that tiny little claustrophobic lift. You know it instinctively as a reader. And how is it going to resolve itself? That fat lady is like a predator, and this little boy is already like a victim, a prey, predated upon. We've already picked up, sensed all these things. Something is going to happen in the lift. You see how it keeps the reader going. You want to know what's going to happen, right? And now the very final point to be kept in mind while reading the story is the theme of the story. Invariably, the writers build it around a theme. There are themes and themes and themes in stories. And there are so many aspects to life. And a writer cannot deal with everything all at once. So he picks up one theme and works his story around it. And in this particular story, fear is the theme. And it is a very, very human emotion. Time and again, we run into situations where we are afraid. And we keep wondering, do we confront that fear? Should we just nerve ourselves up and face it? Or should we just slink away quietly? And then, if we slink away, how do we face ourselves in the mirror? Can we afford to call ourselves cowards? So, as readers, we want to know what Martin did, what finally happened with him. So, I would like you to look for the story, um, you know, on the net. It is called The Elevator by William Slater, and you will find a PDF of it. I'm not entirely sure if the conflict is resolved in the story, but it has all the atmosphere you need, and technically, it is superb. Very, very well written. So, that's it for today, and I've been talking for a fairly long time. I hope you aren't bored to death, and I hope you will remember these 5 points while you analyze a story. Any story will make sense to you if you look at it from these 5 angles. So I'll see you again next time, and do remember to hit a like and subscribe to my channel for more analysis, for more things related to literature. Thank you and bye for now.